One of the most common misconceptions about emulation that is even used by various companies is that emulation is piracy. This is false. In this video, I will not only explain why it's not piracy, but also why emulation is important and is something that should be protected. Even though it is hard to estimate the precise number of players who emulate Nintendo Switch games on PC, it is easy to find million-follower online forums dedicated to emulation and piracy. This fact demonstrates the widespread use of video game emulations, particularly for titles developed and/or distributed by gaming giants like Nintendo. This was the opening paragraph of a free ebook by Denuvo DRM about emulation. Denuvo is starting to create a DRM for Nintendo Switch games that will supposedly prevent emulation, and this book is their pitch to video game developers to get them on board. As you can see, whether on purpose or not, they are already conflating emulation and piracy even though they are not one and the same. When you say that there are a million follower online forums dedicated to emulation and piracy, the minority of that is probably geared towards piracy, while the majority is most likely geared towards emulation. Most emulation forums have strict rules to not deal with piracy. The number one rule on the emulation Reddit is no piracy. The reason is because if they did allow piracy, emulation would quickly be taken away by companies such as Nintendo. The fact is, despite the wishes of companies such as Denuvo and Nintendo, emulation is legal. The precedent for this comes from the court case Sony Computer Entertainment Incorporated versus Connectus Corporation. In July 1998, Connectus started the development of the Virtual Game Station, which was an emulator for the Sony PlayStation. This would make it possible for VGS users to play games developed for the PlayStation on Macintosh hardware, with plans to release a Windows PC compatible version at a later date. Connectus' development strategy was based upon reverse engineering the PlayStation's BIOS firmware, first by using the unchanged BIOS to develop emulation for the hardware, and then by developing a BIOS of their own using the original firmware as an aid for debugging. The Virtual Game Station development reached completion on December 1998, with the software being commercially released in the following month, January 1999. Sony perceived the VGS as a threat to its video game business, and filed a complaint alleging copyright infringement as well as violations of intellectual property against Connectus on January 27, 1999. Sony drew support from fellow video game hardware manufacturers Nintendo, Sega, and 3DFX Interactive, while Connectus was backed by fellow software firms and trade associations. The district court awarded Sony an injunction, blocking Connectus from copying or using the Sony BIOS code in the development of the Virtual Game Station for Windows, and from selling the Virtual Game Station for Macintosh or Windows. The district court also impounded all of Connectus' copies of the Sony BIOS and all copies of works based upon or incorporating Sony BIOS. Connectus then successfully appealed the ruling, with the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit reversing the earlier decision. The decision that was made by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the copying of a copyrighted BIOS software during the development of an emulator software does not constitute copyright infringement, but is covered by fair use. In addition, Sony's PlayStation trademark had not been tarnished by Connectus' sale of its emulator. So now that we've established that emulation is legal, why is Denuvo trying so hard to conflate it with piracy? That's because, while emulation is legal, it can be used to run pirated software. Whether you legally dumped your ROM or downloaded it from the internet, the emulator doesn't care. And so because of this, there are people that use emulators to pirate video games. While I understand the concern, in my opinion, you're barking up the wrong tree while going after emulation. While it's true that you can play pirated games using emulators aren't providing those games. People on the internet are. Even if emulators were banned, ROMs would still be available on the internet for people to download. Emulators aren't the only way people can play pirated games. They can do the same thing with a homebrewed enabled game console. While it might be easier to emulate than to mod, going after emulators isn't solving the root of the problem, and it's not emulators' fault that games get leaked and pirated. What's the difference between a pirated game running on an emulator versus a cracked game running on a computer, or a bootleg DVD running on a DVD player? Just like it's not the computer's fault that the game got cracked, or the DVD's player's fault that the DVD is a bootleg one, it's not the emulator's fault people use pirated ROMs with it. As much as I love homebrew and the freedom it allows users, I can understand that a company wouldn't be so happy with the freedom that it can give users, especially when that freedom can easily be abused and misused, as we see with games being leaked and spread. But if you don't want your games to be pirated, go after the people distributing the games, or just don't let your consoles get hacked in the first place. Emulators have nothing to do with this, so why are we going after them instead of the actual people who are sharing the pirated software? And I understand that it's impossible to truly remove something from the internet, but it's still better than going after emulators, which isn't the root of the problem and ruins a great thing that can be enjoyed legally. Or, better yet, how about instead of fighting emulation, you work with emulation by providing ROMs at a good price, like Sega does? As quoted by Gabe Newell, the easiest way to stop piracy is not by putting anti-piracy technology to work, it's by giving those people a service that's better than what they're receiving from the pirates. And as you can see with Nintendo Switch Online, you're not doing a very good job at that. If you provided a method for people to easily get ROMs, or at the very least made it easy for them to dump their games, people would have less of an incentive to pirate and more people would actually buy your games. As things currently stand, making a backup of your game isn't exactly the easiest task in the world. It can require something like modding your console, which is something you may not want to do or feel comfortable doing, or buying a whole separate device which you may not have money for. In addition, with the current prices of video games in the used video game market, you can end up spending hundreds of dollars just so you can dump a game and try it out in an emulator. With these factors in mind, it makes sense why piracy is so appealing. It's easy to do, and it's free. Now that that's out of the way, let me show you why emulation is so great and is something that can be enjoyed legally. Firstly, I want to make sure that it is known that you do not have to pirate in order to enjoy emulation. There are many ways to get ROMs and system files legally, as I have mentioned in my previous video. The first and most important reason is preservation. With emulation, you can be rest assured that not only your collection of games, but most games in history can be preserved far into the future. As time goes on, video game consoles and even the video games themselves will eventually begin to break and not work anymore. Emulation allows us to take these physical systems and games and preserve them digitally. This also applies to digital games that are tied with the system that they are on. Without emulation, older titles would eventually die with the systems that they are on unless the companies behind them make the effort to keep them alive, which sadly, most of the time, they don't. Emulation allows us to preserve these experiences far into the future. A second reason is the ability to play games on multiple devices. With emulation, you are not limited to the console that the game came on, but any system that supports the emulator for that console. This can enable you to play games on your PC, your phone, a portable emulator, or even a calculator. In addition, you can carry your save file to multiple devices as well, and you can even tie your save file to a cloud server so that you can continue your saves from anywhere. Now you don't have to carry your GameCube everywhere to play Super Mario Sunshine. You can load it up on your PC, or even play it on your phone on the road. The possibilities are endless. A third reason to emulate is video game enhancements. A lot of emulators not only allow you to play your game, but to enhance it. With features such as resolution upscaling, texture packs, and FPS and widescreen patches, you can practically remaster older titles and enjoy them as if they came out yesterday. I recently played Super Mario Galaxy on my PC through Dolphin, and I used an HD texture pack as well as upscaled the game from 1080p, and I can say that it's something that everyone should experience with their favorite games. Before I end, I would like to mention that most emulators and tools used in the emulation community are free. While you are able to donate, the money that the developers make from their work is nowhere near what they deserve for their service. Most of these guys are taking time out of their day to help develop these emulators for the community, and I think a lot of people take for granted the work that they do. They could easily make money by selling their software, but they don't. I say this because these people aren't the evil piracy enablers that they are being made out to be. By all means, they don't owe anyone anything. They are doing what they do because they love it and want to help the community. While companies such as Nintendo or Denuvo are doing what they do for profit first, and the community can sometimes be an afterthought. I can assure you that the emulation community is a wonderful community full of people who are passionate about gaming, and hopefully is a community that you will consider joining. Peace.